There are moments in history that never make it into the books, memories too fragile, too personal to be captured by ink. This is one of them. The year was 1944. The air around Dover was heavy, not with the sound of gunfire, but with silence, the kind that follows too much loss, too many goodbyes. In a lonely mansion overlooking the English Channel, Winston Churchill found himself far from the front, not by choice, but by necessity. Worn down from endless journeys and impossible decisions, he was forced to rest. But there was no real rest, not when every quiet hallway echoed with the names of young soldiers he'd sent into the unknown. The mansion was kept in order by Eleanor, a war nurse who had seen more than anyone should. She understood the kind of pain Churchill carried, not the kind that wounds the body, but the kind that lingers in the soul. As he sat by the window each morning, wrapped in silence and wool, the world outside marched on. But inside those walls, time stood still. It was in that place, isolated, solemn, and shrouded in memory, that one story rose above the rest. A story not of victory, but of the cost of leadership, and the quiet strength it takes to carry the weight of so many futures. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us. Subscribe now and turn on the notifications to help keep every memory and every story alive. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. Charles had once written to his father, every week, signing each letter with a proud flourish, "Your devoted son." But those letters had stopped. Now, weeks passed without a word. Charles was stationed in a secure location with British intelligence, far from the noise of artillery, yet somehow even more distant from the man who had once held his hand at boarding school gates. Margaret, the only daughter, had followed a quieter path. She'd married a Canadian diplomat and moved to Montreal. Her new life was polished and proper, full of receptions and symphonies. She still sent carefully written notes for the holidays, but they read more like reports than letters from a daughter. Churchill often read them twice, once for the content and again searching for warmth between the lines. Then there was Edward, the youngest, the daring one, a pilot in the RAF. He had always been full of fire, hungry to prove himself. But lately even Edward had grown silent. His father's messages were left unanswered. His voice, once loud in the halls of Chartwell, now lived only in echoes. Winston Churchill, the man who held an empire together during its darkest hours, now found himself powerless in the quietest war of all, the one inside his own family. He had given speeches that stirred nations, made decisions that altered the course of history, yet he couldn't bridge the growing silence between himself and his children. One evening, after a long day of meetings and reports, Churchill sat alone in his study at the mansion near Dover. The fireplace had gone cold. The only sound was the slow ticking of a clock. On his desk sat a small, worn photo, his children, young and smiling, untouched by time or war. He reached for it, holding it in both hands, and the weight of it felt heavier than any treaty he'd ever signed. Tears came slowly, uninvited, silent. They traced down the lines of his face, not from weakness, but from something deeper. The ache of distance, the cost of duty. Eleanor, the nurse who had cared for him during his convalescence, stood quietly at the doorway. She had seen wounds before, on the battlefield, in hospital tents, but this was different. This was a wound no bandage could reach. Gently, she stepped forward and sat beside him. "Sir," she said softly, "not every battlefield has trenches. Some are built with silence and walls we don't see." Churchill didn't speak for a moment. He just looked at her, eyes red but full of something fierce and human. He took her hand with the same grip he'd once offered soldiers before battle, firm but fragile beneath. "What good is it to win a war," he finally whispered, "if we lose the very soul of what we were fighting for?" Eleanor didn't answer. She simply remained there beside him, holding the silence so he didn't have to carry it alone. That night, the wind outside rattled the windows as if echoing memories long buried. And for the first time in years, Churchill allowed himself to be just a man, a father, a husband, a soul looking for something that even victory could not return. The world would remember him for speeches, for strategy, for strength. But those who truly knew him, those who saw him in moments like this, would remember something else entirely. A quiet kind of courage. The courage it takes to feel. The morning was thick with fog, the kind that clung to the ground and made the trees look like ghosts. Inside the old stone mansion, the silence was broken by the sudden echo of footsteps. Measured, deliberate. Charles had returned. His coat was immaculate, his shoes polished to a shine. But there was no warmth in his eyes. The staff moved with unease as he passed, sensing something sharp beneath his calm expression. He didn't embrace his father. He didn't ask about his health. Instead, he began to inspect the rooms, flipping through documents, asking pointed questions about property records and legal files. Churchill watched from the study, his cane resting beside him, his face unreadable. He said nothing as his son drifted through the house like a lawyer in a courtroom, more interested in signatures than memories. Eleanor noticed too. She had grown close to Churchill over the past months, and she had learned to read the spaces between words. That afternoon, she found Charles in the drawing room, holding an old letter in his hand. Without asking, she spoke. "Are you looking for papers, or are you looking for your father?" Charles didn't flinch. He looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Both, perhaps. But Eleanor saw through him. This wasn't a son in search of reconciliation. It was a man chasing influence. He didn't want to understand his father. He wanted to possess what was left of him. Later, she sat beside Churchill as he sipped a cup of lukewarm tea, his hands slightly trembling, not from age, but from something deeper. She leaned in and whispered what she had seen. "He didn't come for you, sir. He came for your shadow." Churchill closed his eyes. He didn't argue. He simply sat there, the words sinking into a place already too familiar. "I fear," he said quietly, "that my name is more alive in the mouths of the powerful than in the hearts of my own children." Outside, the fog still pressed against the windows. Inside, the silence returned, but this time it was heavier. Not because of what had been said, but because of everything that hadn't. The fog outside seemed to whisper memories, pulling Winston Churchill back to a moment long, buried in the shadows of war. It was the spring of 1940, a time when Europe stood on the edge of collapse. Churchill, then newly appointed Prime Minister, had crossed into France under utmost secrecy. His destination, the crumbling defences along the Maginot Line, where tired French soldiers clung to hope with more courage than supplies. It was there, in a trench lined with rain and silence, that he met Lieutenant Louis Delacroix. Louis was young, but his eyes carried the weight of generations. Mud streaked his uniform, and his voice was steady as stone when he said, "Loyalty is measured when the world lies in ruins." Churchill never forgot those words. Through every speech, every summit, and every sleepless night, they echoed inside him, like a compass guiding his sense of duty. Now, decades later, in the quiet halls of a mansion filled with more memories than visitors, those words returned louder than ever. He felt it keenly, the distance of his children, the emptiness that followed each letter left, unanswered. His legacy, once the rallying cry of a nation, now felt like a fading echo within his own home. But fate, with its strange sense of timing, had not closed every door. Louis Delacroix, no longer the young lieutenant in the mud, had become a respected military attorney, and through a trail of letters and wartime friendships, he had remained in contact with Eleanor. When she told him about the growing tension at the mansion, the silent battles between father and son, Louis didn't hesitate. He sent a message back, handwritten and heartfelt. He offered to come, not to claim, not to judge, but to help. His promise was simple: to assist Churchill in organizing a legacy built not on influence, wealth, or control, but on what truly mattered: gratitude, loyalty, and honor. The same values they had once shared beneath a grey sky and the thunder of distant artillery. For Churchill, weakened in body but still sharp in memory, the offer brought a rare sense of peace. Someone remembered, not just the speeches or the victories, but the man behind them. Someone still believed that loyalty, even after all these years, meant something. And for the first time in weeks, the silence in the mansion seemed to lift, just slightly, as if the past itself had come back, not to haunt him, but to stand by him once more. Margaret arrived just after midday, stepping out of the vehicle with the grace of someone who had long since learned to hide behind protocol. Her coat was tailored, her gloves spotless, and behind her stood 2 Canadian soldiers, an official escort that said more about politics than family. She crossed the threshold of the mansion slowly, her heels echoing against the old stone floor. When she reached her father, she leaned in and offered a polite embrace, brief, practiced. "Sorry for the delay, Father," she said, her voice measured. "The war complicates everything." Churchill stood motionless for a moment, his gaze resting on her face, not with anger, but with something closer to quiet disbelief. It wasn't just that she had changed, it was that he no longer recognized the warmth she once carried so freely. "When you were a little girl," he said slowly, "you used to call me your hero." His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from something deeper, something hurt and unresolved. "Now I see only a stranger, wearing medals that don't belong to her." Margaret forced a smile, the kind meant to brush discomfort aside. "It's just time, Father. That's all." But Churchill shook his head, gently but firmly. "No," he replied, "it's not time. It's absence." His words hung in the air like dust in sunlight, quiet, inescapable, and painfully true. Around them, the house remained still. The same paintings on the walls, the same creak in the stairs, but nothing felt familiar anymore, not even family. And in that stillness, a truth echoed louder than any gunfire could. Sometimes, what war changes most isn't found on battlefields. It's found in the space that grows between the people we thought we'd never lose. The air inside the mansion grew heavier with each passing day. The echoes of strained visits and quiet disappointments lingered in every room. Yet one name still remained unspoken at the dinner table, though it weighed on Churchill's heart like stone: Edward. He had always been the bold one, the boy who turned toy planes into squadrons, who ran toward the unknown with reckless courage. Now he was a pilot stationed far from home, somewhere, above the clouds and beyond reach. But Churchill couldn't let the silence stretch any longer. One morning, with more effort than usual, he called Eleanor into his study. His voice was tired, but there was resolve behind it. "Find him," he said. "Please, I need to speak to my son." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She reached out through every channel she could. Letters, contacts, scattered signals. Days passed. Then, finally, a response came through the radio. Crackling, hesitant, and honest. "I'll speak plainly," Edward's voice said. "I'm not the boy you remember. I've seen things that changed me. I don't know if I can look you in the eye." Churchill stood quietly, one hand resting on the edge of the desk. The message cut deeper than he had expected, but there was no anger, only sorrow, and something deeper still: understanding. He took the microphone, his hand trembling slightly, and spoke with the weight of everything he had left unsaid. "Then look at me as a soldier, not as a son. Because even generals, even prime ministers, sometimes leave this world longing for just one more embrace. There was no answer, just silence. But 3 days later, without warning, a vehicle pulled up to the mansion gates. Edward stepped out, alone. His uniform was wrinkled, his boots dusty, his cap slightly askew. He didn't speak. He didn't salute. He simply stood at the front door for a long moment, as if trying to remember how to enter a place that once felt like home. Inside the hallway, he froze. There, just a few meters away, sat his father, frail, pale, his once commanding presence now softened by illness and time. Edward didn't move. He just stood there, eyes wide, lips pressed tight as the weight of all the missing years came crashing down on him. He turned his face away and stepped back into the corridor where no one could see. And there, alone, hidden from view, he wept. No words, no sound, just tears carried by memories too heavy to hold. Only when the pain had quieted did he wipe his face, straighten his jacket, and finally walk into the room where his father waited. In the quiet of a rainy afternoon, the old study filled once again with the sound of pen against paper. With the guidance of Louis Delacroix, Churchill began to draft a final declaration, not of wealth, but of values. It wasn't about titles or land, but about memory, loyalty, and the things that truly endure when everything else fades. He called it his war testament. Not a legal document, but a moral one. A legacy shaped not by bloodlines, but by presence. Together, they outlined his wishes. The mansion, with its creaking floors and war-worn walls, would not be passed down to his children, nor would the collection of handwritten diaries or the locked cabinet filled with confidential wartime records. Those would go to Eleanor, the nurse who had never once left his side, not in illness, not in grief, not even in silence. To the one who remained, he told Louis, go the things worth remembering. As for his children, he wrote them each a letter by hand, not full of bitterness, but of memories, warnings, and fragile hopes. Words carved from the quiet ache of a father who had once carried them in his arms and now carried their distance in his chest. When the time came to read the testament aloud, the air inside the drawing room grew still. Charles listened with stiff posture and growing fury. His jaw tightened with every word, and when Eleanor's name was spoken, he couldn't hold back. This is an insult, he snapped. A nurse inheriting what belongs to the Churchill name? The room tensed. Eleanor lowered her gaze, but Churchill didn't flinch. His voice was calm, yet firm, etched with the weight of a lifetime. You inherited my name, he said, but not my spirit. There was no argument after that, only silence. Because deep down, even Charles knew, some legacies are not earned by blood but by staying when others walk away. And in the end, the things worth passing on are never locked in safes or sealed in envelopes. They're found in the hands that held yours when no one else would, and in the eyes that saw your soul long before they judged your title. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and stayed there. A pale light filtered through the windows of the mansion, falling softly across the worn armchair where Winston Churchill rested, his breathing shallow, his strength all but gone. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand wrapped gently around his. She had stayed through every fever, every silence, every moment of weakness that others had been too afraid to witness. Now, she stayed still, offering no words of comfort, only presence. As the minutes passed, Churchill opened his eyes one last time, finding hers with a quiet steadiness. I'm here, sir, she whispered, her voice calm, certain. I'll always be here. He gave a faint nod. And then, with a final breath that felt more like a release than a struggle, he was gone. The mansion, once alive with footsteps and voices, sank into silence. Not a ceremonial silence, but something deeper, the kind that follows the end of something truly great. The funeral was held with little fanfare, no grand speeches, no military parade, just the echo of loss. Edward stood beside the casket, his head lowered, his eyes red and unfocused. The war had hardened him, but this stripped away even that armor. He cried quietly, like a son who had finally remembered the boy he used to be. Charles stood stiffly at the edge of the gathering, his face locked in place, his jaw set with anger he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was pride, maybe regret, maybe something else he didn't dare name. Margaret, dressed in black, barely looked up. She spoke softly into a telephone, her words lost behind her perfectly painted lips. Her presence felt more like obligation than mourning. Only Eleanor stood firm. She held the sealed envelope close to her chest, the one containing Churchill's testament. Beside her, Louis Delacroix watched in silence, understanding more than words could say. "He didn't pass as a politician," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes never leaving the casket. "He passed as a father, forgotten by the very soldiers he called his own." The wind stirred the trees above them, as if the world itself paused to listen. And for a moment, in the stillness of that cold morning, Churchill's true legacy wasn't measured in power or war, but in the quiet ache left behind by a man who gave everything and asked only to be remembered. The room was stark and cold, the kind of place where voices echoed longer than they should. Once a military base, now a modest legal office, it held the weight of memory in its walls, scars of another time, another fight. Inside, gathered around a weathered oak table, sat the remnants of a fractured family, waiting for one final truth to be spoken. Louis Delacroix unfolded the testament with care, his fingers steady. The silence was heavy, sharpened by expectation, pride, and unresolved pain. He began to read. Churchill's words were clear, handwritten in deliberate strokes. There was no bitterness, only resolve. The mansion, with all its memories and history, would go to Eleanor. So would the stewardship of a newly established foundation, the legacy of victory. A home for wounded veterans, forgotten heroes, and those left behind when the parades ended and the lights dimmed. To the one who stood when others walked away, Churchill had written, "I entrust the home we built during war and the mission we must continue in peace." As the final words left Louis's mouth, the room fractured. Charles shot up from his chair, fists clenched, voice raised. "This is absurd. A nurse inheriting the Churchill estate? This foundation, this gesture, it's sentimental nonsense." Margaret sat frozen, her lips parted, unable to form a response. Her world of decorum and diplomacy had not prepared her for this. Edward remained still. He didn't look up. He simply bowed his head and closed his eyes, as if hearing the voice of his father once more, clearer than ever before. Charles leaned forward, his face flushed. "I'll challenge this, legally, publicly." He wasn't thinking straight. But Louis stood, his voice calm, grounded in something Charles could no longer touch. "Sir Winston wrote these words with full clarity," he said. "He knew exactly what he was doing. The measure of a man is not in what he hoards, but in what he builds, and in whom he trusts to carry that legacy forward." No one responded. The air seemed to shift. Eleanor, sitting quietly in the corner, said nothing. Her hand rested gently on the envelope, now open, its weight no longer sealed. She hadn't asked for any of it, but she would honor it because he had trusted her not just with a house, but with the part of his soul the world had forgotten. And in that quiet room, where so many battles had been waged with words and silence, something new, began to take shape. Not a victory, not yet, but a change. Months passed, and the winds of war gave way to quieter days. The legacy of victory, once only an idea on paper, had become something real, something living. Eleanor now oversaw the foundation with quiet strength, her presence calm but unwavering. Veterans found shelter there. Some came broken in body, others in spirit, but all were welcomed with dignity. Edward stayed close, no longer the lost pilot afraid to return home. Alongside Eleanor, he gave his time, his hands, and at last, his heart. Margaret, too, offered support, quietly and without fanfare, finding meaning in a cause that spoke louder than politics or pride. Charles, once so furious, had lost his legal battle, but something deeper had changed. One cold morning, he stood before his father's resting place alone. No entourage, no anger, just silence. He knelt, removing a small insignia from his coat, a badge from his service, and laid it gently at the base of the stone. "Forgive me," he whispered. There were no cameras, no applause, just wind moving through the trees and the sound of footsteps walking away, lighter than they had arrived. The mansion remained, not as a relic, but as a home. Its walls no longer echoed only with grief, but with laughter, footsteps, and quiet moments of healing. Children of veterans played in the garden. Old soldiers sat beneath the trees, sharing stories not of loss, but of survival. Eleanor watched them all with eyes that had seen too much and yet still chose to hope. And though Winston Churchill was no longer among them, his presence had not vanished. It lingered in the letters he wrote, the foundation he inspired, and the people who had finally chosen love over legacy and healing over hurt. He had once led a nation through its darkest hours, but in the end, it wasn't the speeches that endured. It wasn't the politics or the monuments. It was this, the quiet return of his children, the hands that rebuilt what war had broken, and the forgiveness that bloomed in unexpected places. Some say greatness is measured by victory, but perhaps it's measured instead by what we leave behind, not in stone or power, but in the hearts we mend and the lives we touch. Did you already know this story? What would you have done in his place? What other stories about soldiers and veterans should be told? If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one. Until next time, may every story remind us of the strength it takes to forgive and the courage it takes to remember.